Hey, how's it going, guys? It's Nate here. And perhaps the most puzzling civilization to have ever roamed the lands of Skyrim were the Dwarves. Long gone by the time the events of the Elder Scrolls V kick off, the Dwarves, or Dwemer, were a race of lavender-skinned elves that spread across the lands of northern Tamriel, known for their incredible technological sophistication and the massive cities and outposts they built beneath the ground. Below the world surface, entire metropolises once bustled with Dwemer activity, and the noise of their various robotic guards and servants. They famously saved their snow elven cousins when humanity came threatening to exterminate them, though turned them into disgusting goblin critter slaves. So perhaps not the most benevolent thing to do, but I digress. Mysteriously, despite their utterly incredible achievements and legendary intelligence, in the year 700 of the First Era, their entire race just disappeared, vanished into thin air. Not a single Dwemer would ever be seen in Nirn again. And today, their legacy is but a handful of underground ruins, populated by their old robots that still churn and guard the halls, as well as the ancestors of their snow elven slaves. The Deep Folk are undeniably among the most interesting societies to have ever existed in Elder Scrolls history. And with the race so curious and creative, well, you better believe there's a few things worth noting about them that Skyrim fails to make obvious, or even blatantly hides. So today we'll be taking a look at 5 things they never told you about the Dwarves in the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Starting off, they may have domesticated flying whales. Okay, so this is a big one to lead into and is going to require some explaining. So, believe it or not, flying whales, or snow whales, are a pretty well-accepted and understood species of creature to have existed in Elder Scrolls lore. And yes, they're exactly what they sound like. Whales that can fly around in the sky, and also swim in the water a good bit. They're known to have prospered in Skyrim long ago. According to various texts, they're all extinct now, having been hunted into total extinction by invading humans shortly after mankind began to settle the land. In fact, there's a theory that they were really all eaten by the dragons that followed mankind's arrival, but that's a whole nother topic. Anyway, despite their clear existence in Elder Scrolls lore, Skyrim as a game doesn't really acknowledge these creatures all that much. Characters never talk about them, we never have any quests related to this now lost species, and unless you do some of your own research online or explore the lore of other games, it's easy to miss the fact these things ever even existed. Well, while Bethesda didn't exactly reference these organisms much, that doesn't mean they were completely forgotten. You see, if the player heads on over to the dwarven ruins of Kagrenzel on the far eastern edges of Skyrim's border, near the Velothi Mountains, you can find something very intriguing. Now, already by itself, Kagrenzel is one of the more fascinating dwarven ruins in Skyrim, even if you're not looking for information about whales. You enter it through a strange trap door that only activates after you've been inspected by some orb thing. It's weird. And then you're dropped into some weird 100-foot-long tunnel into this big, gigantic pond. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and many suspect this entrance wasn't originally made for people. But what I'm interested in is what you'll find if you look around that tunnel as you're dropping through it. Or just use console commands to get an even better look. What you'll discover is that peppered all around this funnel are whale bones. Wait, what? Yeah, all over the place. Whale skeletons. How did these get here? Even more incredible is that if we decide to access the local map while in Kagrenzel, we can in fact see the whale bones sketched into it. So not only did Bethesda place these models in the tunnel, they went so far as to have a developer draw them on the map. So the obvious question we're led to ask now is, why are these things here? What were whales doing in a dwarven ruin? To try and develop an explanation, let's take a look at Kagrenzel beyond its entrance mechanism, as it's pretty unique even by dwarven standards. Unlike most dwarven ruins we enter, Kagrenzel isn't really some underground metropolis, series of tunnels, or an outpost. Really, all it is this giant cave we fall into. we can follow a series of smaller, more natural tunnels that will lead us to Stony Cliff Cave, where we can exit the ruin. But that's pretty much it. That's all this place is. This gigantic, open space. My personal theory is that this was where the Dwarves were keeping a bunch of flying whales. They were using all of this open air as a flying whale pen. Today, or at least by the time the events of Skyrim kick off, it's very much flooded with water, but it's entirely possible that back when the Dwarves were still operating, this place was nothing but air. Or maybe the entire place was flooded and the whales were swimming. Who knows? I honestly can't think of any other use for this location. It's so incredibly small and occupies virtually no important role in any of the game's quests or narratives, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. There's just no reason for this place to exist unless Bethesda was trying to communicate something very unique. Now, what were the Dwarves doing with their flying whales? Were they harvesting them for meat? Maybe flying them around like mounts? Well, that's a question only the Dwarves would be able to answer. Next on our list, Dwarves, despite their name, weren't really all that small. They were, in actuality, totally average-sized elves. And ironically, because of that, they were a little taller than most humans. This is a well-established fact in the Elder Scrolls' lore, and is even obvious if you just pay attention to some of the concept art. But if the dwarves weren't so tiny, why were they called dwarves? That just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, right? Well, we're not 100% sure, really. However, I'll share two theories, and one of these is probably right. The first is a pretty simple, anticlimactic explanation. Dwarf is simply a mistranslation of the word Dwemer that stuck. The Deep Folks always called themselves Dwemer, and it's possible that when interacting with other races, cultures, and languages, some societies just found that hard to say, and accidentally called them dwarves, and the name just stuck. The other theory, that I like a little bit better, and seems more in line with the kind of storytelling we're used to by Bethesda, is that they're called dwarves because that's what they were called by the Giants. Giants, kinda like the dwarven ruins of Kagrenzel, are a mysterious concept in their own right. We don't know a whole lot about their race, origins, or society. But we do know that they've been living in roughly the same regions the dwarves occupied in Skyrim and Morrowind for thousands of years. At least since before the first Nords came and conquered everything in the Merethic era. Some think giants came from Atmora, the same place the humans came from, but just arrived a long time before the rest of the people. Others suggest that they're really natives to Tamriel, and have been here just as long, if not longer than the Elves. Whatever the case, we know giants and deep folk were around at the same time, and definitely in the same area, so they certainly interacted a good bit. It's possible when these two races connected, maybe the Dwemer were the first normal-sized bipods giants had ever seen, so they thought of them as dwarves. This may seem kind of strange if you haven't done a ridiculous amount of studying on giants. I mean, Skyrim doesn't exactly present them as the most intelligent folk, and they're portrayed as incredibly primitive. So it's hard to imagine them forming complex relationships with a society as advanced as the dwarves and giving them a name that sticks. Though, keep in mind, Skyrim's own loading screen claims giants have their own language. We just can't understand it. They also clearly are capable of some degree of written communication, giving the symbols they paint everywhere. And heck, there's even a giant in the dwarven ruins of Blackreach, just wandering around. Yeah, seriously, that's another mystery. But it suggests that dwarves and giants were absolutely interacting on some complex level, and maybe, just maybe, the giants left their mark on this intelligent society. Coming in at number 3, we can't talk about the dwarves without discussing their strange disappearance, and asking why they vanished. Quite possibly one of the most asked questions in the Elder Scrolls universe, there's endless possibilities regarding what could have happened to this ancient civilization. From them all just dying and disintegrating, to the entire race being teleported to another dimension. We just don't know. However, some of Skyrim's cut content may give us a little bit of insight and set us on the right path to figuring out What went wrong with these oh-so-industrious people? Within the game's files, we can find an unused spell called Conjure Dwarven Sphere. Now, this isn't accessible in the game itself without the use of mods or console commands, so it's probably not safe to consider it canon, though it does reflect upon what Bethesda was thinking. When added to the game, this spell allows the player to, well, conjure up a Dwarven Sphere machine, to act as a follower until it runs out of HP or is replaced by the player, much like any Antronach or summoned Daedra. Okay, Nate, I hear you ask. So there was a spell that would have allowed you to summon a Dwarven Sphere robot. What's the big deal? Well, the reason this is pretty significant is due to how conjuration magic really works in the Elder Scrolls universe. Contrary to how it's described, when you conjure something in Skyrim, you're not actually conjuring it. You're not just spawning in new matter or creating new creatures. What you're doing is pulling them from various dimensions and locations and simply teleporting them to you and binding them to your will. This is a really fascinating concept I could spend all day talking about. But when you summon, say, a Dremora, you're not birthing a new one or anything. Instead, you're literally just pulling one out of oblivion and binding him to you for a little while. It's said that there are entire lava-y dimensions of Oblivion that are just totally populated by flame Antronachs, and that's where we get those guys from. Apparently, there's another pocket dimension where there's a lot of storms, and that's where storm Antronachs come from. You get the picture. So the fact that we're able to use conjuration magic to summon dwarven items suggests that we're getting them from somewhere, that they're still out there. Not dead, just not on Nirn. Many within the community suspect that when the dwarves disappeared, they actually went to their own little pocket plane of Oblivion. This is backed up with a decent amount of substance. Phaleon, a very gifted Redguard mage we can meet in Morthal, who is also, of course, very mysterious because Skyrim, claims that among a long list of achievements, he actually met a dwarf in Oblivion, which is a pretty blatant claim when you think about it, and it doesn't seem like he's lying. The only real uncertainty here would be whether or not this dwarf he met in Oblivion was one of the dwarves that disappeared long ago, or a special sort of unique case. Additionally, Arniel Gain, a professor at the College of Winterhold, has an entire subquest line dedicated to trying to replicate the event that caused the disappearance of the dwarves on a micro scale. Basically, he's trying to figure out what it was the dwarves did and do it, but just to himself. In that questline, he does succeed, but all that happens is he disappears, and then everything ends. Like, that's it. So, unfortunately, answers there are limited. Though, after completing Arniel Gain's series of side quests, we do earn a new spell that allows us to summon his Shade to fight alongside us for a while, which does suggest he's in another dimension. Which one? We're not so sure. Whatever the case, it does seem the dwarven race is out there, somewhere just far out in space, and/or time. For our fourth spot, while we're still talking about what happened to the dwarves and where exactly they went, I want to talk about one specific, really interesting out-of-the-box theory that we should probably take very seriously. Allow me to introduce you to Michael Kirkbride, a former writer for Bethesda Game Studios, who worked on the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard, the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, and the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. Kirkbride left Bethesda shortly after the release of Oblivion, but his love for the Elder Scrolls universe remained, and long after his departure, he continued writing Elder Scrolls lore. He wrote entire in-universe books, and multiple stories from the first person portrayed by Elder Scrolls characters. He posted most of this content on his own blogs and in various different forms. Now, since Michael didn't work at Bethesda by the time he wrote most of this, it's difficult to call it canon. I mean, to some extent, I guess it's really fan fiction, but it's stuff we should take particularly seriously due to his history actually working at Bethesda. And indeed, many of the things he wrote about shortly after leaving the company after the release of Oblivion came true in Skyrim. So it's safe to say that things that he's thinking about are at least in-universe possibilities. In multiple write-ups, Michael Kirkbride claims that the dwarves didn't go to oblivion or anything like that. Instead, he suggests they were sent forward in time, to the 9th era. Mind you, Skyrim takes place in the 4th era, and the Dwarves disappeared in the 2nd era. So they would have jumped ahead in time tens of thousands of years. At this point, Kirkbride suggests that the rest of the universe had just progressed so well technologically, all of the Dwarves' innovations and advancements were largely obsolete. It's implied that some really bad things happened to the Dwarves after they made this leap, now that they couldn't defend themselves with their technology, but things are left very ambiguous. According to Kirkbride's writings, things are really weird in the 9th era. There are super advanced robots that make the Dwarven automatons look primitive. There's apparently a little bit of a space war going on. It's insane. And I can't stress enough that Bethesda themselves have come out and said that things like Kirkbride's writings, while they appreciate the dedication, shouldn't be taken as canon. It's very possible that in the Elder Scrolls 6 or a future title, we'll be given a totally different explanation regarding what happened to the Deep Folk. But knowing how some of their most influential writers feel about the whole matter definitely gives us some interesting and fairly helpful insight. And finally, last on our list, it's believed that the Deep Elves could communicate with each other telepathically. At least to some degree. Exactly how far this extended, whether or not a dwarf in, I don't know, somewhere in Skyrim could telepathically communicate with someone all the way in Morrowind, is unclear. Maybe you could only telepathically communicate with other dwarves in your same room, we're unsure. However, there are two different books we can find that reference this ability, and unfortunately, they both do it in passing and don't describe it in great detail. The first is Doors to Oblivion, a book written by the apprentice of a former well-known powerful mage, who allegedly disappeared while exploring Oblivion. In that book, the author briefly discusses telepathy, saying the following, quote, "The Psijics and Dwemer can, in the Dwemer's case perhaps I should say, could, connect with the minds of others, and converse miles apart, a skill that is sometimes called telepathy. Over the course of my employment, Xenos and I developed such a link between one another." End quote. The second book that references this is the, oh my gosh, I'm going to butcher this, Chimar Vimidium, written by a certain Marobar Soul. The book itself is taken from a series of recently rediscovered tablets, in which the Dwarves documented some sort of military conflict they once had. These tablets were then published and circulated all across Tamriel. Towards the end of this book, we can find a series of publisher notes that offers additional insight on the story we're reading. In these publisher notes, the publisher briefly mentions the dwarves' ability to possibly telepathically communicate with one another, saying, quote, "Another aspect of this legend that scholars like myself find interesting is the mention of the calling. In this legend and others, there is a suggestion that the Dwemer race as a whole had some sort of silent and magical communication. There are records of the Psijic Order, which suggest they too share this secret. Whatever the case, there are no documented spells of the calling." End quote. The author goes on to suggest that maybe part of the reason why it was possible for the entire Dwarven race to disappear at once is somewhat connected to this ability. Maybe all of the dwarves were mentally called together just before the event that led to their disappearance. Or maybe it had absolutely nothing to do with that. Again, there's a lot left about this ability that's unexplained. How frequently did the dwarves do it? Exactly what was this communication like? Were the dwarves able to speak and send entire sentences to each other? Or, I don't know, maybe just pictures? There's a lot we need to figure out. Regardless, it's abundantly clear that this now long-gone race of elves were more than just some pretty faces who can make some neat robots. And with that, we are going to wrap up. Thanks for watching, everybody. Real quick, I have to say, this was probably one of my favorite videos to make, like, ever. I had an incredible amount of fun doing the research for this topic. While reading through various in-game books, texts, and looking at various articles, I learned a lot about the Elder Scrolls universe. which is kind of saying something when you've been playing the games like for a living for the past, I don't know, 3 years. It was a fun experience. Anyway, thanks so much again for stopping by, and hope to catch you all in my next video. Peace out, everyone.